This is joint work with Molly Lipscomb, generously funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So the product that we're considering is desludging of peri-urban fecal sludge pits in Burkina Faso. So there's two options that households have for removing sludge. The first is to hire a truck. This costs $30 to $50, which is a significant amount of money for these households. The truck shows up, it pumps the sludge away, and it removes it from the neighborhood. The second option is called manual desludging. You can either hire someone or a household member cracks open the lid of the pit and removes it with a bucket and a trowel. If you do manual desludging, the sludge is typically not removed from the neighborhood, which means that there can be severe externalities, particularly for children. People will typically remove the sludge from the pit, but then they'll bury it nearby, and when it rains, it'll kind of get in the street. And this is a good example. This is kind of where kids play. So we have all of the market failures. There's a significant search friction or missing market problem. So it takes time to find a trucker. The median time is 12 days, but it has a long tail. And the reason is you don't want these trucks around centers of economic or social activity. So they're typically outside the city, or they're kind of driving around like ambulances. And people only need the service every 12 to 18 months. So they typically don't have kind of like a Rolodex of truckers. People will ask around, but there's a lot of search strategies that you think would be obvious, but they fail. Right. So because of that, the truckers have a limited amount of market power when they negotiate. Right. So these prices range from $30 to $50. And I know if I'm negotiating with someone, if they reject my offer, they're going to have to go back and search for another truck. Right. Because of this, a lot of people resort to manual desludging. But this has negative consequences, particularly for children. So diarrhea is a leading cause of death of children under 5 in sub-Saharan Africa. Epidemiologists are very concerned with this problem. They call it environmental enteropathy. Children end up stunted, and they have a significant number of developmental disadvantages. And epidemiologists have found that human fecal sludge plays a role in this problem. And then, households and service providers have incentives to overstate their costs, especially to us as people trying to intervene in the market. So we have all of the market failures, and they're leading to significant welfare loss. So in terms of the development literature, they call this, general question of how to deliver aid in terms of social programs to beneficiaries targeting. So this includes things like proxy means testing. That's where I'll go around and look at information about households and try to determine who is poor, and people who are under a particular poverty line, it's usually an official one, they will get some kind of assistance. There's ordeal mechanisms. In one RCT, they literally just had people count seeds. So they said, your bid, it's an all pay auction, and you're going to count seeds for me. And the people who count the most seeds are going to win. There's community-based selection games. These are, can vary in kinds of how complex they are, but we can kind of vote for one another. And you can see there would be significant challenges in terms of incentive compatibility, getting accurate kind of guesses of who should deserve aid. And then we have auctions. The households who say they're willing to pay the most will receive the good. And you could include BDM here, the Becker, DeGroot, Marshak type pricing. So here are examples. So what does our project do? We have two basic questions. What is the best way to design a market to maximize take-up of healthy services? What are the benefits to society? So stage one, we're going to collect market data on 2,000 households' most recent desludgings and use a generalization of the second price auction to elicit their willingness to pay for a desludging from us. Right. We're going to use similar auctions to elicit firms' costs, and this is going to give us kind of the fundamentals of the market. Step two, we're going to design an incentive-compatible pricing rule that maximizes use of mechanical desludging subject to a budget constraint that allows $3 per household. So that's about 12% of a mechanical desludging. So we're going to have a pile of money that's available in terms of subsidies, and we're going to ask, if our next population looks like this one, how would we design a platform to maximize take-up? And then we are going to deploy that design on a new sample of households. We're going to make essentially take it or leave it offers based on the optimal pricing rule from stage two. And then we're going to have a control group. So we're going to be able to measure the impact on manual utilization, the market share of mechanical, and health indicators relative to our control group. So that's the basic outline of the project. So just a quick preview of the results. On average, so the average treatment effect in terms of mechanical take-up is going to go up 5 percentage points overall, but the effect is concentrated in the households who receive the lowest price from our platform. That's going to go up about 9 points. And that's where the entire treatment effect is concentrated, because the richer households who are getting quoted higher prices, they're already taking up mechanical at rates above 90%. So what we're doing is effectively figuring out who are the reasonably poor households, and we're setting a price using data to get them to switch. So this is pretty challenging, especially for something like proxy means, where you typically you have like a data set and you're just like trying to guess who's poor, and it may be a serious problem to even know how much aid you have to give them. That's all being determined within the context of the experiment. Mechanical desludging increases by 10 percentage points and manual goes down by 12 among these poorest households. Diarrhea incidence among children exhibits a 5.9% drop in the most heavily subsidized households relative to the control group. So the way I think about this is, if you look at the epidemiology literature, they get similar numbers from households buying a new toilet. So it's consistent with the idea that, like, if your household's toilet is broken, children are getting diarrhea at same rates as if you didn't have a toilet at all. And then when the experiment restores a working toilet to the household, it fits like these previous numbers from a different literature. So due to reductions in total costs, so we use auctions to procure services kind of in bulk. We don't, depending on how you decide the price, which is a little bit ambiguous because we're buying in bulk and then passing it on to households, we only lose a few dollars after accounting for the subsidies. Not in terms of cost effectiveness, but just in terms of the budget of the platform. So that's just a basic preview of our results. This is a decentralization conference. Most of you are theorists. So I'm gonna spend a little bit more time maybe on the design in terms of how do we think about this targeting question from the perspective of mechanism design. So we're gonna have our households. They have observable characteristics X, and this is how we're gonna do the targeting. We're gonna look at the households and say to ourselves, who do we think is probably poor or probably rich, conditional on what we know about them. But each household is going to have a privately known willingness to pay, W, and that's going to be distributed FW conditional on X, and they'll have a privately known mechanical price that they have in mind. Right. So we can think about direct mechanisms. There's a probability that we will serve a household reporting a type W, a type R, conditional on their observables X, and they will make a payment conditional on their reports and their observable type. So their expected payoff here is, with some probability, we will provide the service. They will get their willingness to pay minus their payment to us. With some probability, we will not provide the service, and they will get their outside option, which would be the maximum of W minus R and 0. So this is going to determine who selects into buying a mechanical desludging on their own and who buys a manual desludging. So their outside option is this maximum of W minus R and 0. And we're normalizing the payoff to manual to 0. So that's just our basic model that fits with the literature in a lot of ways. So they're going to be maximizing their net utility of participating. Right. So when we show up with our tablet, we do our survey and we talk to them, they're going to be thinking, what is the minimum of W and R? Because if my willingness to pay is above the price that I could have gotten anyway, W is not relevant because I can go to the market and I can get the service at a price of R. That's what I expect. On the other hand, if I'm priced out of the market and R is greater than my willingness to pay, the relevant number is my willingness to pay. So it's really the minimum of the two that determines my incentives. So only that minimum is going to be the kind of thing that we can incent to be honestly reported. So we have our standard incentive compatibility. Right? A mechanism is incentive compatible as long as my net utility from reporting honestly is at least as good as misrepresenting myself and reporting a different willingness to pay and a different outside price. And it's going to be individually rational as long as I'm better off participating than walking away. So we are explicitly including these things. And then we're thinking about, like, what are we really doing as the people intervening in this market? Well, we're going to be maximizing a measure of social welfare. So we're going to think of BX as the benefit to X getting service and CX as the cost to serving X. Right. So what we're going to do is maximize take up of the beneficial service in our design. And we have three constraints. So we have our classic incentive compatibility, classic individual rationality, and then we have an expected budget constraint. So we had about $3 per household, and $3 is not going to go to every household. If you're relatively rich, what we want to do is charge you a relatively high price. And if you're relatively poor, we want to charge you a relatively low price, as long as we think we can get you to take up. All right. But we're making a transfer of T, conditional on your reports and your observables. And then we have minus the cost of serving you. So we want our expected budget balance to be greater than 0. We're dealing with hundreds of households here. So we think expected budget balance is fine as long as you believe in the law of large numbers. And that is how we conceptualize what we're doing in this environment. So why is this different from maybe some of the other problems that we look at? So we're maximizing a measure of social welfare subject to a budget constraint, along with traditional IR and IC constraints, but I care what the household would have done in the absence of the platform or the intervention. Right? So I'm trying to maximize take up overall. I'm not just trying to maximize the people who take up on the platform, right? I'm not just trying to maximize the profits of the platform. Right? So we're competing against this existing market, and we're not acting as monopolists, and that significantly limits, what we can do, what we can achieve. So in a picture, what happens? In the absence of the intervention, right, people for whom their willingness to pay is greater than the price that they would face, they would buy the service on their own. On the other hand, people for whom the price of the service is above their willingness to pay, they would fail to buy the service. So there's kind of 4 groups that are created when we quote a price conditional on X. There's the people who switch into buying from the platform. Sorry, that's these folks. These are the participating buyers. These are the people who would have bought anyway, but now they're buying from us. We don't, they might help us by relaxing our budget constraint, but they don't help our objective function. On the other hand, there's non-participating buyers. They would have purchased anyway. Right. So we're happy about them. They don't harm our, budget constraint. They're getting the service. Then there are non-buyers. These are the people that we really want to switch from manual to mechanical. We want to reduce those negative externalities. And then here are the people who we are happiest to be serving. They are the switchers. They are the people who would not have purchased anyway, but because we're quoting this relatively low price, they join the platform. So what does optimal pricing look like in a world like this? Well, this kind of equation will be very familiar. So if lambda star is the Lagrange multiplier on the budget constraint, right, posted prices are going to be optimal, and they will satisfy this condition. So we'll have the price that we quote to a household with observables X is going to be their cost of service plus their informational rent. And if this was just profit maximization, we would cross that off. But because we're maximizing social welfare, right, we're going to have the social benefit of that household being served divided by the marginal benefit of a subsidy dollar times this term. So this term represents the inference about the person's motive. Given their X and the fact that their willingness to switch is above the price that we've quoted, what is the probability that this marginal household is going from a non-buyer to a switcher? So these households here compared to someone going from a non-participating buyer to a participating buyer, which would be these households here. And the inference we're doing is saying, what is the probability that they're one of these households divided by the probability that they're one of these two households? The hazard rate is the probability of being exactly on that line. And that's how we're weighting people on the margin. So that's how we do inference in terms of saying, conditional on your X on this price that we're quoting, what's the likelihood that we're switching you versus we're just subsidizing you? So the designer here ends up being a profit-conscious social planner. And the dual of this is profit maximization subject to a quality constraint. So you can see how this kind of works. So as lambda goes to infinity, they're going to be maximizing profits. That's just the classic, price, monopoly price. And then as lambda goes to 0, this term will become very negative, and they'll just be subsidizing everybody. So that's the basic mechanics of how you do price discrimination. when you have this kind of objective function. So what are the design advantages of this relative to what people typically do? So proxy means testing, it doesn't exclude it does exclude relatively rich households. So what am I doing? So proxy means testing, right? I'm trying to guess if you're rich, and I'm saying, get out of here. I just want to give aid to the poor households. We're not going to do that. We're going to say, like, look, I know you're relatively rich. That's fine. I'm just going to quote you a higher price. And I'm going to use that to get you to pay into the system. And I'm going to cross-subsidize other poor households. So I don't look at relatively rich households as a problem. I look at them as a source of potential revenue. Versus auctions, right? We're going to be using the observables X to vary generosity to households. Now, I know that we can design very complex auctions. I love complex auctions. But compared to a standard kind of auction that people would use in this environment, you can imagine something, and this is the design that was used in Senegal for a similar purpose. Households call in, the platform runs a procurement auction for them in real time. They pass the low price to the household, and the household accepts or rejects. It's a simple and effective design. But in a lot of ways, it's going to be subsidizing households who would have purchased anyway. It's doing all that work to find the desludger, get this negotiation going, drive the price down. So the gains are really accruing to households who would have purchased anyway. Like a lot of social policies that we think are interesting, they typically, like the 529 plan or the HSA, a lot of things that we think are going to benefit poor households, they don't actually take up, and it ends up subsidizing relatively rich households. So these are advantages of this kind of design. And it's endogenously going to determine program generosity conditional on X. So we sit down and we say, are we actually going to flip people from non-buyers to switchers? We can use data to address that question in advance, which again, if you really were committed to making proxy means work, you could run small scale experiments and try to figure out in advance what the right level of subsidization is. But often in proxy means, the coupons or, however you're setting up the aid, it doesn't get redeemed by the households. And that's a consistent question. Why aren't households redeeming the coupons? Well, it's because the aid, the level of subsidization isn't correct to get them to switch. So that's kind of, the basic idea of why you would want to do this. So how do we operationalize this solution in as few slides as possible? So in terms of the theoretical model, household I is going to be selecting into manual or mechanical on their own based on their two pieces of private information. Then depending on the price we quote, they will end up being a switcher, a non-buyer, a participating buyer, or a non-participating buyer. So what we're going to do is gather previous desledging choices and price data to compute the probability that they're going to buy mechanical on their own. And we're going to treat that as a discrete choice. And then we're going to have the distribution of prices conditional on observables. And then at the same time, so the first part is to ask them about their experiences in the market. And then the second part is we're going to play an incentive compatible demand revelation game to estimate the distribution of their kind of willingness to switch at the time that we do the interview. So this is going to allow us to set up a model where instead of thinking about the two pieces of private information, we're instead going to think about the discrete choice where we have a latent index based on observables between manual and mechanical. And then we'll use the data on the distribution of their reported willingness to pays to figure out whether the price we quote conditional on their observables and whether or not they would have selected is attractive or not. And then we can compute estimates of these probabilities. So this, is we're just going to ask them if they would switch. Just tell us. We're not going to have a big complex structural model that has like a decision rule about when I would switch or not. We're just going to ask them what's the zero of your first order condition, and then we're going to use that data to figure out what it's going to take to get people to switch and what is the likelihood that people do switch. So what is the information this is a really key choice in the model. And we think of there being kind of three sources of information. One is information gathered by the enumerator during a household interview. So we use things like housing type. Is it precarious, concrete, or kind of like a rental rooming house? Whether other households live in the compound, the distance from the latrine pit to the road in meters, the number of people living in the household, the number of women, whether the respondent finished high school. So we will, in the paper, do lots of counterfactuals on these if you do not like them. Some of them I'm not crazy about myself. The second source of data would be information available to a municipal authority. So whether the water bill was more than 5,000 CFA last month, the the previous month's electricity bill and CFA, and whether the household owns a dwelling. Again, the counterfactuals in the paper, if we had to kill this, what could an NGO do? Right. That's a series of counterfactuals that we ask. And then the last source would be informational, available to a continuously operating platform that can keep its own records. So if we've been around for a while and the Senegal platform is still running, they have lots of data on the households. They're going to have their own sources of kind of like how frequently is this household showing up, and they're going to be able to do their own kind of inference on, what these households are willing to pay, how big the pit is, that kind of thing. So as I've said a couple times in the paper, there are counterfactual results using different information structures, changing what goes into the rule. But what happens is the treatment effects are similar, but the budget balance is the thing that seems to suffer. It becomes much harder to guess which households are poor and which are rich. So we end up being too generous on the basis of our information. And this is a great machine learning problem. There's a lot of interesting stuff that could be done with this particular piece of the puzzle. So that gives us household level demand curves, and for the platform and for the good overall. And what you see is for the platform, demand really crashes as the price goes up, as we go significantly above the price that you could get in the market. How do we do procurement? We run auctions. So we have a lowest rejected bid type setup to give firms an incentive to report honestly. Prices come down a little bit, and we use this as our estimate of the price that we'll be facing for procurement. And then prices do come down a little bit as the experiment goes on. So what we'll do is pick a set of prices. So this is the real plumbing of how we designed it. There's going to be a set of prices: 8, 10, 12.5, 15, 17, 5, and 20,000 CFA. The cost of providing household K with service is going to be CK. We're going to be using the inputs from the auction, right? And then AIT is going to be the probability of household I getting a price of T. We are going to put hats on those probabilities. We're going to take those indicators and take the expectation with respect to our experiment and the data we gathered. And we have the switchers, the participating buyers, and the non-participating buyers. That's the overall take up in the market. We're going to say, okay, I want to assign each of these households a price, but that is subject to budget balance. So here are the people we serve, the switchers and the participating buyers. And on those households, we're going to be making a margin of T minus the price of serving them. And then we have our average subsidy. That's got to be bigger than 0, subject to our standard kind of LP constraints. So that is how it actually gets done. And then we have a rule that maps the individual households to prices, but then we map that into observables to prices. If this was longer, I would give more details, but this gets into just kind of the plumbing of how you design the rule. So we looked at ordered logit, random forest, lasso, a bunch of different things, and ordered logit actually gave the best results. So we construct an index based on your observables saying, what price would we like to quote you? And we're going to minimize the distance from the price that we do quote to the ideal price that would have come out of the rule. So what happens is 12.5 and 8 get extremely few households allocated under the optimal rule. So we're going to kill those bins because it actually makes it very hard to fit them. It's really, really difficult to figure out who should go in those bins. And that messes up the matching for the other households to the correct bins. And then we're going to be going to the market with prices of 10, 15, 17.5, and 20. So that is the design. And I know that was fast. If you have a couple, Claire, I've got the chat open.
Terry, you have 5 minutes left.
Cool. Okay. So we take that design and we go and we find a new set of households. So there's going to be 2,944 new households in 92 neighborhoods, and we're going to test the impact of the rule. So the way it works is the enumerator goes to the household with a tablet, and as they are taking these numbers down, in the background, the tablet is computing the price, which it's incredible what you can do now in development, given that like you can just program these tablets. There's no paper, and the data get uploaded to the server that day. It's pretty wild. Okay. So we're going to have a pooled regression that is just comparing people with access to our market to people who are in the control group. And then we will have by price group. So we will interact price group with treatment. So what we're doing is comparing households who did get that quoted price to households who would have gotten that quoted price but are in the control group, so are excluded from our market. Okay, so what happens? In the pooled regression, we have an average treatment effect of about 5% or 5 percentage points. So the average market share is going to be 84%. But when you break that out by price group, the 20K group is already, or in the control group, they're getting mechanical at a rate of 99%. So there's no way that we're going to be able to move that number, right? And the treatment effect on that group is essentially 0. But as you work your way down through the prices, right, it's really the 10K group that has the lowest mechanical utilization. And that's where the entire treatment effect is concentrated. So using this design, we correctly guessed who is going to be likely or unlikely to be getting mechanical. And then we gave the largest aid to those households who, we could both switch them into getting mechanical and were relatively poor. So let's keep moving. Like I said before, if we look within the 10K group, right, there's this statistically significant decrease in the report of childhood diarrhea, and it's comparable to epidemiology estimates of households getting a new toilet. How much does childhood diarrhea go down? And you can think of this as, also children are kind of like the canary in the coal mine. So like if your child is sick from environmental, challenges, you're probably also sick. You just don't know it because you have a stronger immune system. So this is all, not just the children, but everybody in the household is going to be healthier. Did targeting work? So these are non-targeted measures of wealth. And as you go from column to column, what's happening is they're going up. So for cars, the 10K group has 0.06 of a car. It's a very small car. But the 20K group has 1.5 cars. And you see this pattern across the columns. So this we see as evidence that it's not that we made some kind of mistake and we dumped all the aid on relatively rich households, and that's why they took up, right? Like they have low, in the control group, low use of mechanical, and then this pattern's repeated on non-targeted measures of wealth. So we think a little bit of data goes a long way. It's kind of like the way we feel about it. And then if we just look at the ex post budget constraint, so we sum the profit margin for each household, we add the subsidy, and then we sum over all the households. We're making between negative 18 cents and $5. So we ended up I was really worried that I was going to owe like a ton of money to the Gates Foundation or something, but we ended up not violating our budget constraint in any significant way. Okay, and I just want to show one more picture. When we compare in some counterfactual kind of simulations, how does this work? Well, this is kind of like a reverse learner index times the probability that we serve the household. What would proxy means testing do? Proxy means using our data, we have great data, they would kick out the relatively rich people, right? But then the subsidization level would be relatively low, right? Auctions with a subsidy, they're subsidizing people at really low levels, right? So that's like I run an auction, then I knock a little bit off the price to, in expectation, make profits of 0. So it's kind of budget balanced. I'm not really subsidizing the poor people directly. With this design, we're finding the relatively poor people and giving them as much aid as we possibly can. And we have the relatively rich people paying into the system. And that's how we achieve the treatment effects that we get. So compared to reasonable counterfactual simulations of our other kinds of competing designs, like that's the mechanics of like why this works. Okay, so I like this picture too. So and we actually look at, as you vary the subsidization level, how does the treatment effect? So if you had donors and you just sit them down and you say like, what kind of treatment effect do you want? I will tell you what subsidies required. And you can kind of see how different prices come in and out, but we don't have a ton of time. So I will simply conclude. So intermediation of the sanitation market leads to greater market share of improved services and less manual desludging and childhood diarrhea. And in settings where legal institutions are weak, this platform can work as a carrot for the desludgers. It's really hard to regulate these firms, but if you can punish them by excluding them from the platform, there's like a whole set of policy options that are now available to you. And we're also looking at other designs. Senegal uses auctions. Ghana uses current prices to allocate future jobs because they did not like us. The desludgers thought we were scheming against them in some sense. So we had to come up with something that we kept us kind of like out of the middle of things. And then in Uganda, we're kind of doing like neighborhood bundling, which is a popular question. Anyway, okay. Thank you.